When I went outside to do a carburetor rejet video this weekend, instead I found a nail in my tire, and my tire was completely flat. So instead, we will be doing a Virago 250 V-Star 250 wheel and brake removal guide. In this guide, we will remove the fender, brake caliper and bracket, speedometer cable, cable bracket, wheel, and brake disc. Here I'm going to go over some tools you need. I've got some blocks and a jack stand to keep the bike steady. In terms of sockets, I've got a 19 and a 12 millimeter socket. That should be all you need. To the right there, you'll see a 6 millimeter hex socket. This is really handy to get the brake off. If you don't have that, a 6 millimeter hex key will do. In terms of wrenches, I've got a 10, 12, 14, 19, and a ratchet to turn those sockets. A torque wrench is also required, and that impact driver to the right is just something that's very handy to have. Now, this 6 millimeter socket adapter is pretty much the only way you'll be able to get that brake disc off of the wheel. It has a lot of Loctite, and it's going to be on there really tight. So I'm out here with the bike. I've got those blocks crammed under the frame just in case if I lose the bike, that'll keep it steady, and I got the jack stand ready to put under the axle. We're going to be removing that axle lock key, that's the 6 millimeter, as well as that 19 millimeter axle. On the other side, we're going to need to remove the brake. It's these two 12 millimeter bolts. Should be pretty easy. To get the wheel off, we're going to need to remove the fender. It's 4 10 millimeter bolts, 2 on each side. This one on the top holds the brake hose bracket, and then on the other side it just holds on a reflector. So here I'm taking off my brake. Before you do this, if you do not have an impact wrench, I highly recommend trying to remove the brake disc with it still on the bike. Otherwise the wheel's just going to be spinning on the floor as you try to do this. It will be very tight. If you don't find much success, just stop and find someone with an impact wrench because they're pretty tough to get off. So I'm just going to take this brake disc off. I'm loosening the bottom and I'm leaving the top bolt in place for now just to let the caliper kind of hang there. Here on the other side, I'm taking off those two 10 millimeter bolts for the fender. And then on the brake side, I'm taking off the 2 bolts, and you'll see the bracket that holds the hoses in place kind of moves free there. Now the last thing before we move all of this out of the way is the speedometer cable. This here is it has a 14 millimeter hex on it, so you can turn that off if it's really tight. It should come loose by hand. So just unscrew that, and now we can move it all out of the way. You don't want to leave these brake calipers hanging by the hose because it can wear them out. So instead I just hang it here on the foot peg. I'm taking all of my hardware and I'm screwing it back into the threads that they came out of. Since I'm leaving this bike in the parking lot, I don't want people kicking the bolts around or, anything happening to those bolts. Okay, so here we're going to loosen that 6 millimeter hex bolt that locks your axle in place. Should be pretty easy to remove just with a standard Allen key. There's the bolt. Now we're going to remove the axle. It should be somewhat tight. It's going to be a 19 millimeter, so I'm starting off with my wrench here. I've got it oriented so I just put my body weight down and it should come loose fairly easily. Okay, now we're going to try removing this axle. It's going to be kind of fiddly because I have to hold the weight of the bike with my left hand. I wanted to keep this sort of awkwardness in the video so you can see just what you're in for. So we're going to loosen the threads of that bolt all the way out of the left fork, and it's going to kind of drop all the weight at that point. So be ready for it. So right about at this point, the threads are all the way out of that left fork. I'm going to press on the handlebars. I've got the steering locked at this point. You can see it kind of drops free. It's important that you lock the steering. That way, if you lose the bike, the steering isn't going to swing all the way to the left. So I'm just walking the wheel out of the way, and I'm sliding that axle back in. I'm lining up the fork and getting it 3 or 4 threads in. I'm going to move that jack stand in place and rest the entire front of the bike on it. And that's how it's done. Just take your time and be careful. So on the wheel, there's 2 things that you might lose. First is the gearing for your speedometer. Just go ahead and take that out and keep it somewhere safe. And you may have seen as I rolled the wheel out, I lost the spacer there. So find that on the ground and keep it with your speedometer gearing. So I took the wheel inside. I already got the brake disc off, and I needed my impact wrench. Those were on there tight. And here I'm taking my tire off the wheel. I decided to not show a how-to on this. I figure that is best left to people who are more experienced at it. I kept this time lapse in there just for fun. You might enjoy me wrestling around with it in the living room. Okay, so the tire here is pumped up to about 40. Hopefully that'll help everything seat. I'm not going to run it at that pressure, but we're just going to let it sit at that pressure, and hopefully that'll seat this tire down. So I got some Loctite. Optimally, you should be using the blue stuff. This here is orange. This is supposed to be high strength, but removable. So I'm just going to use a really small amount. I used to have blue, but I don't know where it went. Okay, before we take this outside, I'm going to refresh my sealing surfaces. There's 2 seals. This is where your speedometer gearing hooks up. I'm going to wipe all this grime and grease off of here. All this dirt that was getting in, or was threatening to get into the wheel bearings. I'm going to wipe that off. Just a little bit, and that's fine. We'll go to this side, and this side actually has the seal on the wheel. So I'm just going to take a clean portion of towel, just get that. Look how dirty that is. So the seal should probably be replaced soon, but I don't have one on hand, so until I do, I'm just going to put a pretty thick glob of grease. This is just multi-complex high-temp grease. It's the kind that you put, this is from Walmart, it's their old Super Tech branding there. I found this stuff works pretty well. I wouldn't put it in a wheel bearing on a car I plan on driving, 100,000 miles before touching the wheel bearing again, but on a bike where you can get to the wheel bearings pretty easy, this stuff's pretty good, especially for the price. But now that I got these seals greased up, tires at pressure, brake is on with Loctite, we're going to go outside. So I got my speedometer and spacer stored in this box to keep things clean. We'll set those out. So I'm getting ready to set the wheel back in place. I'm going to put my spacer back in on the right side of the wheel. The black cup should be facing the hub. On the other side, I'm going to set my speedometer gearing back in place. There's a rubber seal in the assembly for the speedometer gearing, and there's teeth that engage on the gearing itself in the hub. Make sure those teeth don't tear that seal. It should set in place pretty smooth. Don't force it. So I'm lining up my wheel and I'm going to rest it against my tool bag here. I would say putting the wheel back on is a lot trickier than taking it off. So with my left hand, I'm kind of pressing the bike into the kickstand to take the weight off that jack stand. I'm going to loosen my axle up and set it aside. And I'm lining my jack stand up to catch the bike in case I lose it just sort of near the fork. And see my spacer fell out there, so make sure that doesn't happen. So sort of roll the wheel in place, and you'll start with that axle, and it's easy to get it through the first side, but the forks can rotate on their fork tube, so it might take a bit of fiddling to line it up, and this whole time you're kind of holding the weight of the bike with your shoulder and your left hand. On the other side, you'll want to make sure that your speedometer gearing, it has a little notch on it. You want to line that notch up with this little point on the forks. It should be locked into that. If it's not, you'll have to take the axle out partially and slide that in place. Once you've made sure that's in place, we can go ahead and start torquing down our axle. You'll want to start by getting all the threads down, and then here you can see the torque specs. For the axle itself, it's 42 foot-pounds, and for the lock bolt, it is 14 foot-pounds. So I'm setting my torque wrench, and we'll get that tightened. Okay, now we can start setting our fender in place. You can see there's two notches, one on each side. Those notches are going to go facing the back. So go ahead and slide it in place. And I'm going to take the two 10mm bolts on the left. The top one holds the reflector. I'm just going to get these loosely in place for now. On the other side, we're going to take the brake caliper assembly and kind of swing it in place. You'll want to make sure that your brake pads are properly aligned and then slip the brake disc in between them. It's a bit tricky. I struggle with it a bit here. I'm just getting that top bolt partially threaded for now. I'm going to leave the rest hanging. And then I'll take the two 10mm bolts. I'm starting with the top. This holds that cable bracket in place. Just get everything kind of loosely held down for now. Now I'm going to torque my brake caliper to the fork. The spec for this is 25 foot-pounds. Now that that's torqued down, I'm going to go over all my bolts, my axle, the lock nut, and the two 10mm bolts on each side for the fender. Make sure it's all tight. Alright, we're almost good to go. There's one last thing, the speedometer cable. This has a square profile, and it needs to slip into the square profile in the speedometer gear, so you might need to rotate it and try a couple of times. Once you get it slipped in, you can carefully thread that sleeve over it. It's a brass thread on the speedometer gearing and a aluminum sleeve, so it doesn't need to be tightened that much. Just get it snug. Once you've got this tight, go ahead and recheck all your bolts and tire pressure. Go for a quick test ride. Thanks for watching, and ride safe.